Right, okay. Right, thank you everybody for coming to this webinar on the past 100 years, China, the West and the world, organized by the Global Governance Research Center of the University of China, hosted by Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China, and No Cold War. I'm John Ross. Thank you everybody for coming to this webinar on the past 100 years, China, the West and the world, organized by the Global Governance Research Center. Sorry, something's gone wrong. Hosted by Chongyang Institute. Right, I'm very sorry about that, folks. Okay, which is hosted by Chongyang Institute for Renmin University of China and No Cold War. I'm John Ross. I'm Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute and one of the founders of No Cold War. We've got many leading speakers in the field today who will give their viewpoints on different aspects of the situation. So I will start by giving mine, if you don't mind. Roughly, we can say that there were 4 periods in the last 100 years of the relation between China and the West. In the first, from 100 years ago until 1945, China was primarily seen as in alliance with the West against Japanese aggression. Then second, from 1949 to 1972, we had the period of the Cold War. Then from 1972 up until about 2012, we had the period of détente with or good relations between the United States and China. Then in about 2012, the start of the pivot to Asia under Obama, then the new Cold War under Trump, and this has been continued with no essential changes in policy by Biden. So the first question is this final shift, this 4th period, short-term or temporary? Because many consequences flow from this. My view, other speakers will give their view, but my view, this is a long-term shift by the United States towards a policy of hostility and aggression towards China. And I want to explain the reasons why I think this is, and it's not desirable, it's highly undesirable, but the world has to adjust to this situation. Okay. The reason is most countries define their policies and their objectives internally. For example, China has been striving and now successfully got moderate prosperity. Some other countries may be putting things that they want 3% growth rate. They have internal perspectives. But unfortunately, the United States leading establishment figures have an external goal, which is they wish the United States to be the largest economy in the world and the most powerful country in the world. This is a different way of defining goals, and unfortunately, it's impossible to achieve or to maintain, more precisely. The United States has less than 1/4 of the population of China. It has only 1/4 of the population of India also. This means, as a simple matter of arithmetic, that the moment that China's per capita GDP becomes larger than that of the, becomes 1/4 that of the United States, its economy will become larger than the United States. Doesn't make China more powerful than the United States necessarily, but it makes it a larger economy. And the same will happen with India. If you define the goal as the United States must have the largest economy in the world, and you have a situation whereby it is the most powerful economy, the most powerful country in the world, there is only one conclusion. As you cannot speed up your own economy very much, you therefore have to try to hold down other economies. This therefore would mean that the Chinese people would be, according to this economic policy, forced to accept that they never had even 1/4 the living standards of the people of the United States. And of course, the people of China, quite rightly, will never accept this. And neither will the people of India in the future accept this. Only when the United States abandons this goal and accepts real multipolarity can you have a real change in the policy of the United States. And this, in my opinion, will not happen in the short term. This policy of the United States, however, is not merely against the interests of China. It is against the interests of many other people in the world for a whole series of reasons. It's against their economic interests. If you see, for example, for 5G, you're going to have to pay more for not using Huawei for 5G. It'll be delivered later. Lots of small businesses in India which use TikTok have been forced out of business. This Cold War makes it more difficult to carry out mutually beneficial trade and investment. It makes it more difficult for countries to pursue nationally independent policies because the United States demands that these countries subordinate their foreign policy to that of the United States. It makes it more different to cooperate on climate change. It creates the threat of a hot war. For this reason, many more people than simply the people in China oppose this Cold War for very different reasons. And this is one of the key things to stress about No Cold War. No Cold War is not a campaign for China. There are people who have very different views about China within No Cold War. What it is a campaign against a Cold War. But if this is a long-term policy by the United States, then a lot of consequences follow from this, particularly in such fields as diplomacy, mass media, communications, and so on. When the United States was pursuing a policy which was relatively favorable towards China, it wasn't necessarily a greatly attempt to influence mass public opinion, because the mass public opinion was being influenced by the media in the United States in favor of China. What was important at that time was to get certain very important individuals, very important business people, diplomats, etc., to go to China, and China was extremely skilled in organizing such meetings. Now, however, as a new situation has occurred, an attack is taking place in China. Therefore, all those inside and outside China are involved in a new task, which is the influence of attempting to influence mass public opinion. This involves diplomacy. It involves mass media. It means relating to existing organizations which are outside of China. This has very different relations of forces in different parts of the world. In the global north, in particular in the United States, we may say at the present time that unfortunately relatively small forces, they're significant individuals, have spoken out against this Cold War, and there is beginning to be some opposition in the US Congress, but the general dominant view of the leadership of both the Republican and Democratic parties is against China. The situation in the global north, and particularly in the US, is difficult. In the global south, that is in developing countries, the situation is very different. We saw this very clearly at the meeting of the communist CPC and world political parties. What happened there was there were leaders, if my counting is accurate, of more than 20 states from the global south which spoke. Therefore, there is different conditions for influencing opinion against a Cold War in the global north and in the global south. I personally would particularly look at the two areas where I think there's a real contest for public opinion going on in Latin America and in Europe. If I think that the pro-Cold War forces, unfortunately, will win in the United States and North America in the short term, in Africa and in the Middle East, at least at the level of governments, and in developing Asia, people will resist the Cold War. I think the areas where the situation is not yet clear is what is going to be what is going to happen in Latin America and what is going to happen in Europe. Okay, that's my view of the situation. Now we'll get a lot of other people, and I hope that we'll have a real dialogue. Okay. So the first thing that I want to introduce is Wang Wen, who's the Executive Dean of Chongyang Institute, to present the report which Chongyang has drawn up on relations between China and the world. For those outside China, it's been remarkable to see the development of Chongyang Institute. I've had the honor to be a senior fellow since 2013, when it was just getting out of a startup operation. It got to the situation whereby when there was a seminar on the social sciences in China, Wang Wen was one of the only two, chaired by Xi Jinping. Wang Wen was one of the only two people from economics institutes that was asked to speak, and it's grown greatly in influence, and it's got now senior fellows, some of the speakers which are here. So I'll turn over to Wang Wen and to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I miss you very much. I appreciate your introduction. Also, today I'm very thank No Cold War for cooperating with us again. And also I'm very glad to see a lot of old friends, Martin, Vivian, Margaret, Yuri. I miss you very much. And also today we have a top TV star, Miss Liu Xin, and I know you are a lot of fans online now. And as we all know that 3 weeks ago, it was a 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. And 1 month ago, 5 scholars from China, US, UK, Russia, and Swiss published a series of articles in a leading journal, Social Science Abroad, which is one of the top academic journal in China. The 5 authors included Mr. John Ross and Mr. Yuri. And in this in this journal, we discuss about the 100th anniversary of the CPC. And as we all know that 100th anniversary of founding of the CPC. So this is not only a big day for the CPC itself, it is a very important milestone for all Chinese people and for the development of China. And these 5 articles we wrote, and then we released today, both in English and Chinese, just aim to share with all the friends the significance of the CPC's 100 years from a global perspectives. As Mr. John Lowe said, that in the past 100 years, especially in the past 20 years, there existed a huge competitions between among the big powers. But I just want to share with you what happened in the past 100 years, and also what's the global significance of the CPC's 100 years. So I just want to share three viewpoints with everyone. First, from the viewpoint of the evolution of civilization, the 100th anniversary is a continuation of progressive logic of humanity. While most countries and regions experience regression recent years, especially since the 21st century, when faced with rising protectionism, populism, extremism, and worsening ecology. But China, under the leadership of CPC, keeps on making progress. And the 100 years of the grand history of the CPC is a century when the CPC lead its people to make one point of progress after another. So we all know. So that's why CPC now in China, it has a very high supporting percentage. So that's the first point. Second point I want to share is that from the viewpoint of national development, the 100 years anniversary of the CPC offers an option, promising path of development that both developing countries can learn from. I mean, for the developing countries. So we all know, since the end of the World War II, more than 100 economies have achieved national independence. However, only 2 developing economies in the past half century grew from a low income stage to the middle income stage and eventually to the higher income stage. They are South Korea and the island of Taiwan. And now China might be the third one from a low income stage and middle income stage into higher income stage. So by the year 2025, I think this is a very huge significance. So for most of the world's developing and less developed countries, China's major moves in development have made them execute a Western model. So this is the second point I'm going to share. Thirdly, from the viewpoint of the political party organizations, the 100 years anniversary of the CPC has promoted breakthrough and theoretical innovation in political party system all over the world. So many political parties have been continually in power for decades, but few of them are like the CPC, one with a century long history and one that is still capable of innovation. And such a party is very, very rare, if any, in the West. So compared to the Western political parties, the CPC has shown great differences in members, composition, organizational structure, functions, model of operation, and so on. So it has also provided an effective reference for construction of party organizations in developing countries. So what gives the CPC life and energy is its political cognition and strategic determination that are high, self-aware, self-reflective, and self-confident. So it takes stock of its political tradition and cultural temperament. So something like the 实事求是 in Chinese, is or put theory into practice and taking a root in reality. So it provides important lessons to explore innovation and breakthrough that exist in paradigms of political parties across the world at present. So under such new conditions, it is especially important to study the global significance of CPC 100th anniversary. So I have a very brief I have a very briefly stated 3 points about the global significance of 100 years of the CPC. We will send this report to the official website of the Chongyang Institute, RDCY, for your reference. So more importantly, I just very briefly introduce my point. So more importantly, I hope to hear and learn from your views. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Wang Wen. I'm sure we're going to get a wide range of views here. Okay, our first speaker doesn't need much introduction either in China or outside China, which is Martin Jakes. His book, When China Rules the World, was a bestseller in the West, and he's very well known also from his writings in China. I know he's working on a new book. I'm not asking him to reveal exactly what he's going to say in it, but he's constantly thinking about what is the situation, always worth listening to. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, for those very kind words. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's forum. It's 4.5 years since Trump assumed office and the US assault on China began. The first 6 months of Biden's presidency have seen a continuation of America's anti-China stance. The biggest line of continuity between Trump and Biden is their position on China. This confirms the argument that America's shift on China, far from being some kind of Trumpian quirk, is in fact deeply rooted in American politics and society. We should not be surprised by this. The benign period of cooperation between the US and China from 1972 to 2016, 44 years altogether, was underpinned on the US side by 2 propositions. First, that China's economic rise would never challenge America's economic ascendancy. And second, that as China modernized, it will inevitably westernize and in time become a Western-style democracy. By 2016, it was patently obvious that both assumptions were wrong. China's economy was more or less already on a par with America's, and China's political system, far from showing signs of westernizing, remained highly distinctive, was able to deliver extraordinary results, and was increasingly popular. In the face of this, America came to the view that rather than seeing China as a relatively benign partner, it should instead see China as a threat to its global primacy and find ways to contain, weaken, and undermine it. America had never previously seen China as a threat to its status as the #1 power in the world, nor had it, by the way, in its entire history. We should not underestimate just how important this is to America's sense of identity. It has been fundamental since 1945, but stretches back much further in the form of America's sense of missionary purpose. This explains why America's shift against China has commanded consensual support at home, and why we should expect this period to last for a long time, at least 2 decades, perhaps rather longer. The problem is that America's position in the world relative to China, and even more relative to the wider world, is only going to get weaker, as we have already seen in dramatic fashion this century. America's primacy simply cannot survive. But for America to come round to accepting this will be very traumatic, conflictual, and a long drawn out process. So how should we describe this new phase in US-China relations that started in 2016? In the West, it is commonly called the New Cold War. I think this is mistaken. It is so different to the original Cold War to be misleading. I understand why it is popular in the United States. They won the Cold War. In fact, it was the last thing they actually won. So to call it a new Cold War gives the illusion that it is similar or the same to the first Cold War and will end in the same way. None of this is true. The USSR was never even vaguely an economic match for the US. At its peak, the former was perhaps 60% of America's size. In contrast, China is already on an economic par with the US and will be much bigger in 1 decade, let alone 2, when it will probably be more than double. A fundamental characteristic of the First Cold War was the division of the world into 2 hermetically sealed antagonistic blocs. In contrast, China is deeply integrated into the global economy, in some respects even more than the US. It cannot be excised from the global economy. Its vast array of trading partners around the world make any kind of such exclusion impossible. Military competition was a defining feature of the old Cold War in a way that is not true now. China will not go down the same blind alley that the Soviet Union did. Ideological division, likewise, was crucial in the First Cold War, but is much less relevant now. If not a new Cold War, then what is it? What are we witnessing? What we are witnessing is a competition between China and the US, which is comprehensive, all-encompassing in character, involving a very wide range of issues: economic, technology, especially digital technology, governance and leadership, social inclusivity, the relationship with the developing world, climate change, pandemics, and so on. In other words, to put it another way, which modernity, US or China, will be the most effective and beneficial for the world in the 21st century? Their histories, of course, are entirely different. One rooted in the nation state and imperial expansion, the other primarily a civilization state rooted in thousands of years of history. This aspect, too rarely discussed, by the way, is fundamental to the nature of the competition between the two. Which brings me to one final difference between the First Cold War and the present. The former was a binary conflict in the Nixon tradition, with the final outcome being a winner and a loser. I don't think this competition will be quite the same. One country, I believe China, will gain definitively the upper hand, but essential to any settlement will be a new synthesis between China and the new US, a new kind of relationship, rather than the knockout punch which ended the First Cold War. What are the ramifications of all this? Well, I would make 2 points. First, we should prepare ourselves for the long haul. This phase will, in all likelihood, last, as I mentioned, at least 20 years, but we shouldn't really be surprised if it's more like 40 years. I mean, the benign phase of the US-China relationship, after all, lasted 44 years. This means we must always think long-term. China, of course, has to think long-term. China is very good at thinking long-term. In the heat of 2019-20, when China was under particularly brutal assault from the US and the West, and tit-for-tat exchanges became common, I think a sense of the long term got somewhat obscured or lost even. Tit-for-tat might raise the spirits of committed supporters, but they usually alienate the non-committed. Winning hearts and minds is a long process, not something achieved by a, as the French would say, coup de grace. Which brings me to my second point. The first Cold War was divided into blocks, 2 blocks, and utterly polarized. This is not the case now and will not be the case. Even what might be called a Western bloc, NATO, Five Eyes, US, European Union, and so on, is not a bloc. Nor is there a China bloc, nor does China seek to have a bloc. In other words, unlike in the first Cold War, a lot of the world, most in fact, is relatively non-partisan and open-minded. Now, I go along with what John said about the spheres of the world and the most important spheres of the world, and I regard that to be the developing world. But I'm not going to talk about the developing world. I'm just going to spend a minute or two talking about the West and particularly Europe. Now, Europe is absolutely not in the same place as the US. Indeed, it is shifting away from the US at both a popular and establishment level. It's going to be very difficult to shift US opinion in the next few years, but that is not true of Europe. China has to find much better ways of engaging with the European populations. My watchwords in this instance would be listen, reach out, and dialogue. Dialogue was the antithesis of the Cold War, but dialogue is fundamental to the new phase. Hearts and minds are crucial, and China has to find new and better ways of doing this than it has so far managed, certainly in the Western world and Europe in particular. I think that more or less brings my remarks to a conclusion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Well, Martin certainly gave us the broadest possible historical perspective on that, so that should create us some thoughts. The second speaker also is somebody who's managed to deal with the not very easy art of speaking both to a Chinese audience and to a Western audience. That's Lu Jin, who's a CGTN host and China Forum expert. We've had the pleasure, before the ban on CGTN in Britain, I've seen her on the television many times. I particularly relish her debate with conservative commentator Trish Regan in the United States, which I note that Trish Regan did not wish to repeat. Lu Jin has also shown the ability to speak to a Western audience as well as a Chinese one. She's got over 200,000 followers on Twitter, which exceeds even some of the people, the Western people here. So therefore, she's got a big ability to speak both in China and the West. So the floor is yours, Lu Jin.
Thank you, John. It's such a big introduction, but a lot of responsibility comes with that. It's my very first time to take part in such a forum, so indeed very honored, and many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's so exciting by now. I really want to follow up on what has been said, especially by my friend Martin Jakes, when he talks about China has to do a better job of listen and reaching out and dialogue with the West. I think one more thing probably has to be done also, that is to tell its own story to not just people in Europe, but in all parts of the world. And that's where I try to do as much as I can. And I think that is essential, whether or not we go into a Cold War, however long that's going to last, that we make ourselves understood by people all over the world. That's why I prepared a speech slightly different from the ones that have been given here. In 1921, when the CPC was founded, China was a broken feudalist country ravaged by foreign invaders, where the Chinese could be relegated to the status of a dog in their own country. Today, it's so much richer and stronger that the most powerful country in the world sees it as the biggest competitor. How did the Communist Party of China manage to empower 1/5 of humanity in a century's time without adopting, quote, Western liberal democracy, unquote? This is an essential question for us and also for others. For us, this means understanding ourselves better. History is a mirror. Sometimes we look very nice in it, sometimes very ugly. Only when we see ourselves clearly can we improve on achievements and failures alike. For others, this means potential solutions, especially for other underdeveloped countries. China isn't interested in exporting its ideology, but we shouldn't be shy about sharing our experiences. We learn from others as well all the time. Throughout history, human societies have progressed through mutual learning. So what are some of these solutions? I want to share my experience covering the life and work of a CPC member in the lead up to the party's centenary on July the 1st. Zheng Fuping is an agricultural scientist from Hunan province in central China. He could have lived a comfortable life in his 4-bedroom apartment with his loving wife and sweet daughter, but for the past 3 decades, he has been mostly away from home, laboring away as a deputy mayor in a small county in Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region in the south. His main responsibility is to use his knowledge in fighting desertification to help the locals rise above poverty. Now, such posts, called first secretaries, are temporary, designed mostly to last 2 or 3 years, but Mr. Zheng has stayed on for 27 years. His wife said she thought of divorcing him multiple times. His daughter was a baby when he started out, now she's 31, and he still plans to staying there until his retirement so that the results of the poverty alleviation drive are to be consolidated. I had extensive conversations with him and his family. What struck me the most was his sacrifice. He told me who doesn't want to stay with their family, but he had no choice but then to sacrifice his small family for the big family of hundreds of thousands of locals in a place far away from home. His wife told me he came from a poor rural family himself. The abject poverty he witnessed in Guangxi must have reminded him of his own childhood. He empathized with the villagers and wanted to help them. As both poverty alleviation and scientific research are long-term projects, he extended his stay again and again and again. It takes an iron heart to stay away from family for so long, but when you look at the past century, sacrifice was necessary for China because we were too poor and weak. When others enjoyed their coffee or were on their way to enjoyments, we had to work because otherwise we would starve. Is it possible to relate to that from a Western perspective? The Chinese national flag is red as it's steeped in the blood of millions, including party members who laid down their lives for the country's independence and prosperity. Before China won liberation, 3.7 million martyrs perished, and that's only the number with names. More recently, during the past 5 years when China waged the war to end absolute poverty, 1,800 officials lost their lives on the job. It is the spirit of sacrifice that made the enormous transformation possible. But it's not just blood and sacrifice. All the work is based on a factual and scientific understanding of the world and the laws that govern it. That is a basic feature of Marxism. Understand the world objectively before transforming it. Even Mr. Zheng, with all his dedication to change the lives of villagers, had to obey nature's laws. For instance, you can't farm on karst land, the soil in the county where he works. It lacks nutrients and is prone to sinkholes, and farming will worsen soil erosion. So when the land is too barren to feed the people, what do? He pioneered the practice of resettling people in more hospitable locations in 1996, the first in China. Respecting the natural laws governing the world also means understanding human nature. The first very few years after relocation, he told me, were extremely difficult as the villagers had to start from scratch. They would do farm work during the day and build their homes at night. Some wanted to escape, others wanted to make quick money as migrant workers. But if they left, a season lost on the farm would be a year lost. Mr. Zheng had to keep his eyes on them and try his best to cheer them on. Instead, they devised loans so the farmers were motivated to work hard. Marxism also means to be pragmatic and adapt to changing times. There was no president to follow, and Mr. Zeng had to adapt to the ever-changing circumstances. The villagers began to change the fruit trees they plant every few years in order to stay on top of the market. In doing this, they also protect the soil and ecology. What doesn't work will be replaced by others. Marxism, of course, means to be with the people. Mr. Zeng worked from among the people, and it's clear what they think of him. Let me read out a folk song that a villager composed about him. From Hunan came a Professor Zeng, who's committed to ending our sorrow. Poor were the people back then. He led them to a prosperous tomorrow. They started to live a comfortable life, as if through dark clouds they saw sunlight. What good luck to meet the professor who gave us a life free from blight. Like the oath made in the peach bower, our bond of brotherhood will last forever. Mr. Zeng is a reticent man, but when he heard the song for the first time, I saw his eyes tearing up. There have been 2.9 million such officials in China. After abolishing absolute poverty, now we have the drive to revitalize the countryside. So almost 1 million of them are still on the ground, still laboring away, including Mr. Zeng. Do we need an election to select officials like him? CPC members earn their legitimacy through performance instead of votes. The goal of any electoral system is to find competent officials like him. Why replace it with another one with apparent flaws? Mr. Zeng has been a party member for 36 years, and he's one of 95 million party members. Together with generations of their far-sighted counterparts, they have pioneered what President Xi Jinping calls a new model for human advancement, a new and uniquely Chinese path to modernization. Under this model, a balance can be struck between efficiency and fairness, material wealth and cultural and ethical strength, China's development and global prosperity. I hope this will give you some ideas as to how the CPC has transformed China without adopting quote-unquote liberal democracy. Unfortunately, as we speak, we have to remind ourselves that not only are the answers difficult to take in for some, but they're also rejecting the legitimacy of this question. They're still saying that China will collapse soon. A journalist who was based in China for almost 10 years recently compared the country to Nazi Germany before the Second World War. All kinds of efforts to diminish China's progress and contributions to the world while amplifying its threat dominate international public discourse. I understand that to acknowledge the success of the CPC is to acknowledge that systems other than capitalism may work, and that's unbearable for some. In a recent speech, US President Joe Biden declared that US capitalism is still alive and very well. That it has to be stated is a dead giveaway. Looking into the future, the competition will be keener between the two paths. But I believe what is more important will be the competition between two visions, a world divided between us and them, or a community with a shared future for humankind. Where is the inevitable progress of history leading us? What's the zeitgeist? We can again draw some inspirations from the experiences and lessons from 100 years of struggle and revolution of the CPC. They who stand higher and see further in history will prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I think that the story of the individual, or the presentation of ordinary people, or in this case, an extraordinary person, to the West audience out China is absolutely vital, and it's one of the most important things can be done. It might be your Lu Xin's first participation in such a forum, but I hope it won't be the last, because one thing I would make a comment on is that neither the West nor China are unstructured in public opinion. There are public opinion leaders which exist both in China and in the West, and we have to be able to speak between the leaders of these public opinions. So I think this is a key part of these types of forums. Okay.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Vijay Prasad. So Martin Jakes and I spoke on the primarily on the situation in the global north, although I mentioned a little bit about the situation in the global south, but I'm nothing. Vijay is a very special person from the point of his connections with the global south, not merely because he's written more than 30 books, but also because I know from personal experience he's deeply trusted in his judgment by many, many leaders in the global south. So I'm absolutely sure he'll give us a very, very important insight on that. And I'm very pleased that, like with Martin, he's now also a senior fellow at Chongyang. So over to you, Vijay.
Firstly, it's great to be with you. Thanks a lot, John. You're always very kind. Thanks to the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies and Wang Wen. Very happy to be here. Thanks to No Cold War, which is, of course, our own platform. So I'm pleased to be with this terrific looking bunch of people. On the 19th of July, just a few days ago, after more than a month, the election authorities in Peru certified that Pedro Castillo of the Peru Libre Party is the country's next president. Castillo, a leader of the Public School Teachers Union, led the ticket for a party committed to Marxism-Leninism. He inherits the government of a country that has been suffocated by the privatization and austerity policies promoted by the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. A combination of low commodity prices and the pandemic devastated the country. Peru's external debt is high and its access to resources is low. Castillo promises to rebuild Peru's public health and public education systems, as well as promote a resource socialism agenda, asserting the sovereignty of Peruvians over their vast reserves of copper, zinc, and other minerals and metals. Caught in the vise of an inflation targeting regime and of tight access to financing, Pedro Castillo will have a difficult time moving any kind of people-centered agenda. For the past 5 decades, the IMF has driven a policy framework that has gone by many names, but whose originary name, the first name, describes it quite accurately, and that is the IMF policy of structural adjustment. The International Monetary Fund informs countries of the developing world that the IMF will not provide good ratings for the credit markets unless these countries structurally adjust their domestic policies. Structural adjustment refers to privatization of public services, to the construction of inflation targeting regimes, to trade liberalization, including, of course, subsidy and tariff cuts, and to cuts in spending for human development. These IMF policies eroded national sovereignty, increased suffering for most of the population, hardened gender hierarchies as care work increased for women, and destroyed important social infrastructure. All this happened while the wealthy bondholders in the developed world made sure that they got the debt burden serviced. They got their dollars while the people of the developing world struggled to pay them. During the pandemic, for instance, as an example, 64 countries during the pandemic spent more to service their debt than on healthcare. Let me repeat this for a minute. 64 countries spent more to service their debt, to send money to the wealthy bondholders in the developing world than on healthcare. This is during this catastrophic pandemic. Since 1960, the developed countries drained $152 trillion from the developing world. I mean, this is the best illustration of the impact of the IMF form of development. $152 trillion went from south to north since 1960. That is why 30% of Peru's population of 33 million lives in poverty. What growth Peru saw in the years before the pandemic came largely due to its close linkage to the Chinese economy. This year, Peru and China celebrate 50 years of their diplomatic ties. Since 2014, Peru's largest trading partner has been China, which buys roughly $58 billion worth of goods. The United States, which used to be Peru's main trading partner, buys $33 billion worth of goods, almost half. 2/3 of Peru's copper exports go to China. Two of Peru's main copper fields, Las Bambas and Toromochco, are controlled by China Minmetals Corporation and Chinalco. These Chinese firms have been part of an overall Chinese investment into Peru that totals $30 billion. China and Peru signed a free trade treaty which went into effect in 2010, now a decade ago. 3 major belt and road investments are underway in Peru. A port in Chanque that has received an investment of $1.3 billion, the Amazonian waterway being built by Sino-Hydro, and the transcontinental railway that will link Peru's Biovar port to Brazil's Santos port. The Chanque port is essential to Peru's non-traditional agricultural exports, such as avocados. And you may not know, friends, that Peru is the 3rd largest exporter of avocados in the world. It's only a country of 33 million. They grow lots of avocados. And it's also a major exporter of fruit, which makes up about 50%, half of Peru's agricultural exports. With Chinese investment, Peru has been developing its hydrobiological industries, key to its diversification away from the export of copper ore. Peru's scientists at the International Potato Center in Lima created a variety of potato called Cooperation 88 that brought nearly $4 billion of income to farmers not in Peru, but to farmers in Yunnan over the past 2 decades. In other words, Peru is innovating for Chinese farmers. It is very clear to those of us who watch these things closely that the IMF austerity privatization model is being challenged by the BRI investment and development model. For 50 years, the IMF positioned itself as the only policy framework. The BRI offers a choice to countries such as Peru with an agenda fashioned around infrastructure investment and human development. The BRI is precisely an outcome of the 100-year struggle of the Communist Party of China to create a rational and practical mechanism to advance the cause of humanity. It is also the emergence of the BRI, an alternative to the IMF, that has provoked the United States to contest the emergence of Chinese investment in the developing world, not only in Latin America, but also in places in Asia and in Africa. The West has responded to the BRI, which is an investment and development project, not with a more robust development agenda, but with militarism. This is unfortunate. Recently, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned NATO alliance partners about Chinese developments in telecommunications and in the BRI, particularly in Africa. He said that China is coming closer to us. I've been struck by this phrase from Jens Stoltenberg. China is coming closer to us. He said we need to respond together as an alliance, meaning NATO. The idea that China is coming closer to us suggests the kind of fear-mongering of the Cold War. And we have to look at what the response of the alliance has been. It's been the strengthening of the Quad in Asia, increased frequency of the so-called freedom of navigation missions in the South China Sea, the new interoperability maneuvers of the US Indo-Pacific Command. It also includes US war games in the Caribbean, such as the recently concluded Trade Winds 2021 exercise in Guyana or the Panamex in Panama and so on. Countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Peru welcome the options provided to them by the BRI. Soon will come a day when they will not have to go hat in hand to the Paris Club and the London Club and beg for debt relief, or to attend to the whims of the IMF study missions, which come for a few days and pass judgment on a country. Sovereign development projects need to be envisioned. The space opened up by the BRI should allow other countries to dream of our own pathway forward. This is the space opened up to Pedro Castillo. The Communist Party of China is to be celebrated for its immense human achievements within China, especially the abolition of extreme poverty. And on July 23rd, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research will publish a document called Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China. I hope you'll have a look at it. It is clear that the BRI project is the CPC's internationalist mission for its second century. This is a win-win dynamic, as the Chinese like to say, a win for the developing countries and a win for China. A win, in other words, for everyone in the world. Adelante then, forward to win-win. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, this is what Vijay said is absolutely fundamental, which is China puts forward, and as other people do, a concept that the international relations are not a zero-sum game, which is the concept of the United States. If one wins, the other loses. They put forward a concept which is win-win, and that's why China is attractive to other developing countries. Okay, for our next speaker, we've spoken a great deal about the global north, and now we've had a very important contribution about the global south, but there is one community which straddles both, which is, of course, the Black community in the United States, because of its origins in Africa and in slavery, and its position in the heart of the most powerful country in the world. There was a wonderful relationship which existed between leaders of the Black movement in the United States and China. Some of the most iconic photographs I know are W.E.B. Du Bois, only 2 meters away from Mao Zedong at China's National Day celebrations on Tiananmen Square, or Malcolm X's words on Mao Zedong and what it meant for the rise of China, and how that aided the whole of Africa and the American African community, or Muhammad Ali with Deng Xiaoping. Now, Margaret Kimberley, who's our next speaker, did us the honor of speaking at our launch meeting of No Cold War, actually on the 21st of July last year. And her speech, I know, got 300,000 hits within 2 days in China. So she made something of an impact. So Margaret, I'm looking forward to what you've got to say, as I'm sure the whole audience is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Greetings, everyone. First, I want to thank the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China, and No Cold War for including me again in an important discussion. I am grateful for having joined many of you 1 year ago in another meeting that John just referenced. Unfortunately, US relations with China have worsened since that time. It is no exaggeration to say that when we talk about China's relationship with countries referred to as the West, we are now talking about war and peace. It's frankly very frightening to see the ease with which anti-China rhetoric has taken hold amongst the public here in the US. Because of unrelenting propaganda from corporate media and politicians, it is understandable that China is viewed as a hostile adversary by millions of people outside of that country. China is now blamed for every ill in the US. Job losses and espionage are both said to be China's fault. The spread of COVID-19 is blamed on China. And now the claim that it was created in a laboratory in Wuhan is suddenly given renewed credibility. At times, the animus is farcical, as the country with no high-speed rail accuses the country with 10,000 miles of high-speed rail of stealing technology. Any new computer hack is said to be the work of Beijing. I suppose Russians are glad that someone else is now the villain du jour. I remember the change from the dreaded Red China to the country that the US hoped would counter the Soviet Union. Cold Warrior Richard Nixon began the process of establishing relations. when China was later welcomed into the World Trade Organization so that Americans might have an ample supply of cheap goods. Made in China was a joke, but no one is laughing now, and this nation has been turned into a villain yet again as it rivals the US. The means by which this mass psychosis has been created must be examined carefully. The people who were only recently stereotyped as smart and hardworking were suddenly turned into a nation of more than 1 billion brutes, hell-bent on controlling our economy and practicing cruelties reminiscent of the Nazis. Very few people in this country had ever heard of the Uyghurs, but they were suddenly the topic of conversation, as we were told that aerial photos of nondescript buildings were concentration camps, and we were led to believe that the United Nations had declared these allegations to be factual when nothing of the kind had occurred. China is reviled for several reasons, racism being one. The white world cannot imagine itself as being second to any non-white country. It galls that China succeeds where they so often fail. That is how lies and smears are spread. That racism creates jealousy as the failure of American capitalism becomes more and more obvious. Major cities here are unable to house poor people who live in encampments in public places. Half of the states chose to deprive the unemployed of additional benefits that they earned. Medical debt, something unheard of in other countries, totals $140 billion. Student loan debt, also unheard of elsewhere, totals $1.7 trillion. In his attempt to delegitimize the Cuban Revolution, President Biden recently called communism a failure. Of course, this assessment is projection. While the bipartisan austerity in the US continues, China commits itself to ending extreme poverty and creating a moderately prosperous society. Neither of those things are goals for either of the two major political parties in this country. That isn't surprising considering that the duopoly are servants of wealthy people and corporations. People like Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon. Yesterday, he took a brief ride in space. You can do that when you're the richest man in the world. China is also sending people into space, but for scientific purposes, and the public sector controls these missions, as was once the case for the US. We now have an inverted situation. China was impoverished while many Americans lived in moderate prosperity. Now Americans live an increasingly precarious existence, while China brings an improved quality of life. This is a very dangerous moment. At this time last year, Donald Trump began his rhetorical attack on China and closed a Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas, forced TikTok to give control of its US operations to Microsoft. Now we have a new president, one who defeated Trump, yet continues his policies. When his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met his Chinese counterparts, his behavior was anything but diplomatic, as he sought to embarrass them before international media and repeat charges of alleged human rights abuses. Of course, this invective has caused China to strengthen its relationships with friendly countries, as it should. Last week, China's foreign minister met with President Assad in Syria and proclaimed support for a peace process and rebuilding that country, which was nearly destroyed by the US and its allies. The US demands that nations in that region either become vassals or be done away with altogether, as happened with Libya 10 years ago. It's difficult to assess the relative merits of other countries when the US is one's only point of comparison. Our country is run by an oligarchic class which has two parties to choose from and getting what they want. The only change we see here is reactionary, as politics moves further and further to the right. The only trends are downward, with people getting poorer and bubbles about to pop, as happened in 2008. On the other hand, China sometimes acknowledges its leaders' mistakes and is capable of radical changes in its course. I recall when Deng Xiaoping visited Western countries, and he even attended a rodeo in Texas, where of course he wore a big cowboy hat and was greeted with great fanfare and positive press attention. That is because China was expected to give up socialism. It didn't, and it prospered and became independent and leaped ahead of Western nations. And now it is being punished for all of those reasons. Workers in Xinjiang are being deprived of jobs because of boycotts which claim their labor is forced. Workers harvest cotton in Xinjiang, but now lose their livelihoods because of cynical ploys hatched in Washington and carried out in other Western capitals. Even worse, people here are being fed a steady diet of what can only be called war propaganda. Their views about China have changed yet again, and as before, the change comes about when the narrative changes at the top. China was bad, communist, red China, then considered to be a source of cheap products that would give up socialism, and it was then seen in a positive light. Now it is bad again, and the words Chinese Communist Party are used like a slur and are on the lips of every congressman member and in the corporate media too. Of course, they work in tandem and no one should be surprised. The ultimate goal is to pressure China the way it was pressured in the 1800s and to take direction from nations which it has now surpassed in many ways. But China isn't weak, and the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party proves that to be the case. This puts the US in a bind. It can try to destabilize Hong Kong, and it can take jobs away from Xinjiang, but it can't get rid of socialism, which has done so much for the people there. When H&M clothing stores announced that they wouldn't use products with Xinjiang cotton, Chinese consumers chose not to buy from H&M in a show of support for their country, which has benefited so much from this system called socialism with Chinese characteristics. It is a system that is stronger than that of Western nations who fail at doing any of the things they claim to do for their people. As I said, we're at a critical moment when the US and its allies seek to subvert nations choosing to be independent of their influence. In turn, they push back, as they should, but this dynamic is a dangerous one. Those of us with any awareness know that we can learn from what is called New China and its accomplishments in the last 100 years. Unfortunately, we live in a country determined to tear all that down, and we are left to be fearful of many ominous trends. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. This, I think, reminds us of the different situations in different parts of the world. As many speakers have stressed, there is a long, hard fight ahead in the United States to turn around public opinion. And Margaret reminds us, however, that there are people that in the United States are determined to do this. And on the other hand, we have the new president of Peru, who's now going to look at what his relations are going to be with China. So this is a very differentiated situation in different parts of the world. The next speaker is Radhika Desai, who's professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Now, Radhika's known for many things. One is her particular view of economics in geopolitical economy. She's very active on the question of numerous international topics, and the International Manifesto Group, which she de facto convenes, holds fortnightly meetings in the West, which I personally regard as a must-do in order to attend, to discuss many questions of international politics, one of the central ones of which is certainly relations with China. So over to you, Radhika.
Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure and honor to be once again with the Chongyang Institute. I want to talk about, obviously, the subject of the day, the CPC and the West in the past century. How did it come about that the United States is trying to lead the entire West in dislodging one political party from power? To answer this, we begin with the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci and his understanding of politics. Mass politics meant that individuals such as Machiavelli's The Prince no longer made history. For Gramsci, the modern prince was the political party, and it had replaced the prince. This new entity was a complex element of society in which the cementing of a collective will, recognized and partially asserted in action, had already begun. It was the first cell containing the germs of a collective will, which are striving to become universal and total. Gramsci's words are more true of parties of working people, workers or peasants, than parties of the propertied, which remain groups of notables, more or less certainly attached to whatever they can pick up in terms of a popular base. Of the thousands of parties that exist or have existed, the centenarian CPC is not only the most successful, but one that conforms to Gramsci's definition exquisitely. The CPC's success means that China dominates the news cycle of our time, thanks to admiration for its achievements and smoldering Western resentment against them. This Western resentment has historically deep roots. Chinese and third world critical intellectuals understand clearly, as I argued in Marx and Engels as well, that capitalism is inherently imperialist. Not only working classes, but also nations struggle against capitalist exploitation and imperial domination. And that gives the struggle for socialism a geopolitical as well as a political economy. So far, workers in the imperial homelands have failed to overthrow capitalism. Successful revolutions, beginning with the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, have overthrown capitalism outside the imperial homelands, and they have struggled for socialism as well as national liberation. And the geopolitical economy of this struggle has dominated over its political economy. This places actually existing socialist countries in the forefront of the battle for socialism. And today, the Communist Party of China leads it. For working people and oppressed nations, China has therefore become the indispensable nation, a term hitherto used to express the US's leading role in leading capitalist countries. Only continuing sage leadership will keep the CPP leading allied classes and nations and advancing the socialist front against the capitalist forces on the geopolitical economy terrain of their contest. That contest began soon after capitalism was born. Marx had barely flicked out his pen and smoothed his writing paper when China's century of humiliation began at the hands of capitalist imperialism. With its origins in the intellectual ferment that began as a result of this development, the CPC has opposed Western capitalism and imperialism, but it hasn't opposed the West as such. The most powerful of the West's critical elements, Marxism, inspired it. This was not about taking what is good from the West, but rather aligning itself with the historically progressive forces that exist in the West, precisely as a result of the West's capitalism and imperialism. This intelligent alliance bespeaks an internationalism and even a cosmopolitanism that the West does not have and cannot afford. China is not anti-Western. The West is anti-China. This is a critical distinction. The idea of capitalism versus communism is misleading because it ignores imperialism. The West is against China's prosperity, as a number of speakers have pointed out, and that of other third world countries. However, they are not against Western prosperity, only its imperial foundations. The CPC has fought the complex battle against Western capitalism and imperialism since its founding in 1921. And in its course, it has a number of achievements to its credit. It has gained the trust of the Chinese people and kept it. It defeated Japanese fascism in a critical contribution to the Allied victory in the Second World War, which cost the Chinese 20 million lives. Then the West was, at that time, the West was forced, the historically imperialist and capitalist West was forced into a position favoring the advance of working people and oppressed nations. Thereafter, the CPC won a civil war, made a communist revolution, destroyed feudalism, and implemented the most thoroughgoing land reform. It suffered unrelenting hostility and aggression of the West for decades, including in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It increased production, productivity, life expectancy, and literacy among its people. It joined other third world countries in resisting Western imperialism and making world governance more conducive to their development needs. It asserted itself against what it considered profound domestic and international compromises with capitalism and the West. The compromises with the capitalism and the West made by the senior communist-led countries, the Soviet Union. It had to make costly errors in seeking to control its own industrial destiny. It developed deterrent nuclear weapons despite the Soviet Union's last-minute withdrawal of technical assistance at considerable domestic expense. It corrected its own political deviations, if chaotically, through the Cultural Revolution. It made terms with the West without capitulating to it in the interests of China's people. It launched a major change of direction in the reform and opening up of the 1980s and 90s, humoring West's illusion that the CPC would abandon its historic commitments and permit China to return to its subordination to the West, which of course it did not intend. It oversaw the greatest industrial revolution in the history of humankind. In the space created by the prodigious productive energies it unleashed domestically and by the United States and the West's productive debility. It began focusing more on the domestic economy as the West slid further, losing much of its attractiveness as an economic partner in the new century. It successfully suppressed the virus that most leading capitalist countries, far richer than China, are still struggling with. And finally, as we know, most recently, it eradicated extreme poverty. All this has been possible because of the CPC's deep roots among the people of China, its decades-long and hard struggle through which it proved itself to the people and developed its own abilities by learning hard lessons well before it had managed to make a successful revolution. Its ability to cynicize Marxism and develop it in relation to China's needs and its evolving historical destiny. Its collective leadership that ensures that it survives even its greatest leaders. Its ability to take responsibility for its errors. Its ability to learn from facts. Its ability to be flexible in the face of necessity. No modern human organization combined longevity with success to this extent. The CPC has restored China the economic, cultural, and technological centrality it once enjoyed in the world and put the country that only 70 years ago was among the poorest within sight of modest prosperity. If doing all this for a nation of 1.4 billion people, a fifth of humanity, were not enough, the CPC has kept alive the socialist alternative into our time, when capitalism's senility is showing in its unproductive and financialized character, its skyrocketing inequality, its deepening social divisions, its fracturing politics, its distorted culture. Precisely when we need socialism, China has kept it for us alive. It has also made socialism more attractive. The CPC has also made socialism more attractive than most communist-led nations hitherto, the Soviet Union included. The attraction is dual. The CPC-led China is an example, if not a model, of a socialist market economy. It is also a partner, not least given the initiatives of the past decade, which various people have mentioned, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRI, and many others, which deepen China's historic traditions of aid and South-South cooperation. Nowhere is this clearer than in China's success, along with other socialist economies, against the novel coronavirus. While capitalist countries are openly sacrificing lives at the altar of profits and capital, which they have the gall to call livelihoods, what the West really is, and the alternative that the CPC and China under its leadership constitute, has become a life and death question for the oppressed people and peoples of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Radhika. The next speaker is Yuri Tavrovsky, who's head of the Russian Dream and Chinese Dream Research Center of the Izborsk Club in Moscow. Of course, Russia and China have a deep historical relation. It was the example of the Russian Revolution which inspired the creation of the CPC. And for a long period, the CPC saw itself in alliance with the Soviet Union. Then, of course, in 1991, what Vladimir Putin referred to as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, that is the disintegration of the Soviet Union took place, and a great setback occurred in the Soviet Union. This is where, just so I can put a personal note, I became involved, because in 1992, I went to Moscow to wrote an article called Why the Economic Reform Will Succeed in China and Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe, the aim of which was to try to persuade Russia to follow the line of the Chinese economic reform, not that of shock therapy. This was a total failure in the sense of success. But on the other hand, ever since then, one has had contacts and knows the closer relationships which still exist between Russia and China. And Yuri Tavrovsky, who's participated in many events with Chongyang Institute, is one of Russia's leading experts on China. He has profoundly patriotic views on the development of his own country, and I think everybody else will be absolutely fascinated to hear what he's got to say. So over to you, Yuri.
Уважаемые коллеги, друзья, добрый день. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, speaking at a ceremony marking centennial of the CPC, Chairman Xi Jinping made a truly historic statement. As we have upheld the developed socialism with Chinese characteristics, we have pioneered a new and uniquely Chinese path to modernization and created a new model for human advancement. To make sure this idea will not go unnoticed, Chairman Xi explained it further at the World Political Parties Summit a few days later. He said, history and practice have proven and will further demonstrate that this path by China is the right and correct one. And we will continue our journey on this bright avenue, both for ourselves and for the benefit of the world. He further stressed, there is no one-size-fits-all model for modernization, and countries must find whatever is best for them. For its part, CPC is willing to exchange and share experience with political parties of all countries, so we can do more good for our people and people around the world. This statement has historical importance from at least 2 points of view. Point one, for the first time, socialism with Chinese characteristics was acknowledged in Beijing as a new model for human advancement. This is a major breakthrough in Marxist theory, elevating to global dimension the Chinese experience in developing a big nation along socialist ideas to unprecedented material and spiritual success. Chinese communists adopted the universal Marxist theory, modified it according to real conditions of their nation, and step by step created a totally new combination of theory and practice called socialism with Chinese characteristics. For the past few years, it was clear for me, as a former apparatchik of ideology department of the Soviet Communist Party, that Chinese communists have actually given birth to a new development model for entire human society, a new standard of national and world governance. After feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, the mankind is now entering the new stage, integrating the best features of market economy, socialist planned economy, and political system, which represents all classes and serves best national interests. Prominent Russian scholar, academician Sergei Glaziev, calls this model integral society. I prefer to use socialism with national characteristics. It is evident that socialism with Chinese characteristics suits China best. Actually, it is the only explanation of People's Republic dynamism in the past few decades and sustainability under harsh conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic and America-initiated Cold War. At the same time, socialism with Chinese characteristics represents the biggest threat to the Western world, based on liberal ideology and free market rules. Western experts in ideology understood that a few years ago. Actually, this is the main reason of the new Cold War, started under President Trump and intensified under President Biden. In a speech he delivered in February, Joe Biden painted a portrait of a world fundamentally divided between democracy and autocracy. I quote, "We are at an inflection point between those who argue that given all the challenges we face, autocracy is the best way forward, and those who understand that democracy is essential to meeting those challenges." And this brings me to the point 2 of explaining the historic dimension of Chairman Xi's statement. He has acknowledged that CPC is not afraid of full-fledged Cold War against China. He has acknowledged that Chinese model of human advancement from now on will openly rival Western liberal capitalism model. Western attacks against the PRC and CPC are not a miscalculation, but a natural reaction to the emergence of a major competitor, not only in economy and defense, but also in ideology. American establishment as a whole, and the Democratic Party in particular, are under strong influence of the neoconservative ideology. The neocons hold key positions in the Biden administration, in the Pentagon and security services, in mass media and Hollywood. Neoconservatism was born and developed in New York in the late 20s among leftist students leaning to the Trotskyist faction of the Bolshevism. Since then, they kept strong hatred towards the Soviet and any other variation of socialist ideas except their own. It explains their traditional antagonism towards the Soviet Union. Mixing their ideas with mainstream Puritanism and Mormon dogmas, the neocons produced a new semi-religious American ideology. The majority of Americans believe they are the chosen people, and their country is the city upon the hill with a natural right to rule the globe. In foreign relations, it explains American traditional exceptionalism and unilateralism. In domestic affairs, lefted traditions of neocons manifest itself in support of BLM and other populist movements, in socialist fantasies of Bernie Sanders, and billions spent on social support. The neocons are afraid that socialism with Chinese characteristics will soon become the main competitor of their quasi-socialist ideas. Ideologies and not trade was the main reason of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Ideology will be the driving force of the new Cold War that America has started against China. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is very attractive to other nations. Yes, China does not export it abroad, does not baptize recipients of its credits and developmental projects. Still, I believe that it should be thoroughly studied and learned in other countries, including Russia. Большое спасибо. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Our final speaker, before I ask Wang Wen to give us a short summary, is Jaya Joshi, who's the visiting professor of Zhejiang University International Business Schools, all those origins in South Africa. China obviously attaches the utmost importance to relation with Africa. It is now a tradition of the last 30 years that the first trip made by the foreign minister of China abroad each year is to an African country. China gave aid to Africa at the time of the struggle against the white racist regime in so-called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And we should not forget that one of the most outstanding international communist leaders was, of course, at the time of his imprisonment, when Nelson Mandela was actually a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party, a rather glorious member of the communist fraternity. So over to you, Jaya. Fascinated to hear what you've got to say. I'm sure everybody is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon to colleagues and comrades. On the 1st of July 2021, China celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. But on the 30th of July this year, the South Africa will also celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of South Africa. The CPSA, as it was then known, was banned in 1950 in South Africa under the apartheid regime, and it later re-emerged as the South African Communist Party. And in July 2021, both the CPC and the SACP will be celebrating 100 years of struggle for building socialism and societies free from oppression, inequality, and poverty. During the early 1920s, many other communist parties were established internationally, and many played key roles in moving their countries towards national liberation, economic development, and securing the rights of workers. We know the role that the communist parties played in Europe during the Second World War. In countries that were colonized in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the communist parties were in the vanguard of the struggle against colonialism, slavery, and oppression. During this period, the CPC was an inspiration to many liberation movements and progressive movements fighting against colonialism. In particular, the Long March of the CPC under the leadership of Chairman Mao and other leaders was an example of how liberation could be achieved by mobilizing people from all groups in society. The similarities in the evolution of the CPC and the SACP does not end with the founding of both parties. Between the 1930s and 50s, both parties were concerned with the national oppression of the majority of people in their countries. In China, the concern was with the massive underdevelopment, exploitation, and oppression of the workers in the urban and rural areas, especially after the civil wars and invasion of China by Japan. In South Africa, the party was concerned about the white settler colonialism, national oppression, and exploitation of workers in the rural and urban areas. In the 30s and 40s, the Communist Party called for the establishment of a Black Republic to address the national question and white settler colonialism. Many members of the SACP became leaders of the armed struggle, including what was suggested today, Nelson Mandela against apartheid. In the 1960s, some of them were sent to China to receive training and were strongly influenced by the leaders of the CPC and the teachings of Chairman Mao. One of the key influences of the liberation struggle in South Africa was the development of the strategy of the National Democratic Revolution in 1969. In this document, it says a national democratic revolution will overthrow the colonial state and establish a united, democratic, non-racial South Africa. The main content of this revolution is the national liberation of the African people in particular, and the Black people, that is the African, colored, and Indian people in general. With respect to the transition to socialism, the NDR argued that victory in the National Democratic Revolution is for our working class the most direct route to socialism and ultimately communism. The principles articulated in the strategy and tactics document resonate with the principles articulated in Chairman Mao's essay on democracy in China, which was published in 1940. Known as the New Democracy, it was a revolutionary strategy that was adopted by the CPC from 1930s to 50s. In the essay, Chairman Mao argued the Chinese Revolution must go through two stages. First, the democratic revolution, and second, the socialist revolution. And by their very nature, they are two different processes. It's not the old democracy, it is a new democracy. This new democracy will lead to the socialist republic under the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the government of all the people under the new democracy, led by the most dispossessed of the workers in the Communist Party of China. This new democracy gives the masses of the people the ultimate decision in the trajectory of socialism with Chinese characteristics. New democracy is a system of real, universal, and equal suffrage, irrespective of sex, creed, property, or education, and it must be introduced. In economic terms, large industrial, financial, and commercial enterprise would come under state ownership. The Republic will neither confiscate capitalist private property in general, nor forbid the development of such capitalist production. So socialism will market for the market. For China's economy, Mao said, is still very backward. The reform strategy introduced by Deng Xiaoping characterizes China's development from 1978 onwards and was also in keeping with Chairman Mao's principles. The reform strategy gave rise to the specific nature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. While South Africa, and I must add the rest of Africa, is still grappling with the many socio-economic difficulties, China has advanced, and the reform process has led to the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. China has recently declared that it has finally eradicated absolute poverty in the country and is on the way to achieving the UN SDGs. The experience of socialism with Chinese characteristics can provide a theoretical and justification in the Marxist tradition. It provides a clear argument to show why socialism with Chinese characteristics follows in the tradition of Marxian debates on socialism. As we all know, the critique of the Gotha program that Marx articulated characterized communism as from each according to ability to each according to needs. But the transition to this ideal is socialism, and under socialism, it is from each according to contribution and to each according to work. This is what characterizes China's socialism with Chinese characteristics. This principle has evolved since the time of Deng Xiaoping to the present. And as China has developed phenomenally over the past 30 years, it has shown how the new democracy can foster innovation, research and development, technological advances, and peaceful coexistence at home and internationally. Despite these advances, capitalist greed and corruption seems bent on sabotaging the development of socialism as an alternative mode of production. This was articulated by other speakers. The model that China presented is seen as a threat to capitalist world domination. And China and other socialist countries have become the target of the new Cold War. Fortunately, the developing world and other emerging markets see through the smoke screen of the new Cold War. With the Belt and Road Initiative, China is showing the world that there's an alternative way to development. The new democracy in China has allowed for some capitalist growth under socialism, but it has prevented the wholesale development of monopoly capitalism with an effective system of state regulation. Although the focus on new development agenda is national in nature, it is now apparent that the success of the country's new growth path is inextricably linked to China's role in the global economy. President Xi Jinping said, to build a more equitable and just architecture that meets the common aspirations of all countries. This is China's goal currently. The new transformation agenda for China, economic transformation and upgrading, will focus domestically on expanding domestic consumption and new types of industrialization, IT application, urbanization, and agricultural modernization while pursuing green growth in the country. Thus, multilateralism in the form of cooperation and an expanded role for new forms of trade and investment is fast becoming an integral component of China's new development model. Consequently, as China takes on more leadership role in the world, the multilateral element of its approach will set to become a catalyst for promoting international investment and the interconnected economy. This new policy is captured in the BRI. It is clear that as China moves towards celebrating the 100th anniversary of the CPC, it will reflect upon its own impact on the world in general and the developing emerging economies in particular. Today, the whole world in general and Africa and developing economies is going through major socio-economic crisis brought on by the COVID pandemic. More importantly, China is one of the few countries that has recorded impressive economic growth. A significant development during the pandemic globally has been China's willingness to assist and support both the developed and developing countries during the crisis. China's development from a very poor and underdeveloped economy to become the world's second largest economy and to be one of the first nations to have lifted 800 million people out of absolute poverty is due to the role of the Communist Party of China, building socialism with Chinese characteristics. Building socialism takes time, but with a dedicated, committed Communist Party leading a new democracy, socialism, and an equitable, moderately prosperous society is possible. It will provide a model from which all humanity can benefit. I thank you, John.
Thank you very much indeed, Jaya. So I'm going to, just in 1 minute, hand over to Wang Wen to make a few concluding remarks, but perhaps I could just take the opportunity to look at some things which is clearly agreed on. Unfortunately, nobody has contradicted the view that the United States is intent for some considerable period to continue with the present aggressive policy. It would be very good if they did, but they're not going to, and nobody here has put forward an alternative view to that. So that's the first thing. So therefore we have to prepare for a long period of activity. Secondly, how different the situation is in different countries. On the one hand, the difficulty in the United States, where you're trying to get small forces together. And on the other hand, as Vijay said, the new president of Peru, or very recently, the new president of Bolivia, who are forming their governments and have to work out their relationships with China. These are completely different situations. Or in Brazil, we have a situation where the present president, Bolsonaro, is engaged in very anti-China rhetoric, and No Cold War had the honor to organize a meeting in Brazil with former President Dilma Rousseff speaking out very clearly against the No Cold War. So here you have an argument which is taking place amongst mass political forces. It's impossible, given the size of this and the differences between these countries, to arrive at a view immediately of understanding all the complexities of this situation. That's why I think that such dialogue as we're having today is absolutely vital. Because I work in a Chinese institution, I'm unfortunately not there at the moment because of COVID. I'd be much safer if I was in China than I am in Britain, but I was out of country when it started. I know the discussion which takes place in China, and a very intense discussion. There's also a big discussion which is taking place in the West, of which we've got various of the important participants here. So I think it's absolutely vital, given the importance of the situation, the complexity of the situation, that we continue to engage in the type of dialogue we've got here. And finally, therefore, I want to just pass it over to Wang Wen and thank Chongyang Institute very much for hosting this program, putting it together. And over to you, Wang Wen, for your final remarks.
Thank you, John. My colleague told me that today there are more than 300,000 global audience are listening to our discussion online, not only in Chinese Weibo, Chinese Toutiao, but also in YouTube. So which shows that today this is a very, very important topic. So I agree, totally agree with Martin and John that China's economic influence is far bigger than that of Soviet Union. And if there is a new Cold War between China and the United States happen now, the damage to the world will also be much bigger than that was the Cold War many decades ago. So that's why I think the No Cold War initiative for the organization become much more important than before. So, but the problem is now is to how to make the world understand the Communist Party of China, and not regard it as a demo So Ms. Liu Xin, I think she did very well, and she right now introduced very good stories of Communist Party of China, Zheng. So like Zheng's story, I think in China there are many such stories like Zheng. I remember once on a foreign United States, an American friend openly asked me like that, "Are you a party member?" I said yes. So, and then he asked again, "What are party member?" So I answered, first of all, party members should devote themselves to serving people and have higher self-requirements. So I believe that, as Ms. Liu Xin said, that most members of Communist Party of China share this belief. And as we all know that China has over 90 million party members, which is an important reason for China progress, very important reason for China progress in the past many decades. So now the question is, as a Vision said that why did the whole country get poorer and richer, get richer in the past half century? So we need to reflect. We need to reflect. So what we need now is not a new Cold War, but learning from each other, making progress together. And from this perspective, the world underestimates China's experience and distorts the experience of Communist Party of China. So as Margaret have said by now, the United States is not willing to recognize China's progress and treat the Communist Party of China in a normal way. So this is a key, I think. So I agree. I agree with I agree with Professor Desai. He said that we need push the songs and the songs cooperation. We need more, much more mutual trust and cooperation. And I think nowadays, as we agree that Americans' suppression of China is not democracy versus autocracy. It's not freedom versus dictatorship. But the difference between mutual aggression and progress, stop versus hope, bad governments versus good governments. These are my opinions. So I think more importantly, as a Professor Yuri said, that human being now need to have more progress in thinking. And I also agree with Jaya that we need to absorb the past experience. So final, I have 3 sentences to say finally. First, thank you again for your friendly, objective understanding of China, my old friends. And the second is that I hope we can have more dialogues in the future to sum up the lessons and the experience of the past of the world. And this, last but not least, let's make more efforts for world peace and development. So that's all, John. Thank you. Thank you again.
Okay,
Yeah.
folks, that's it for this time, but I'm absolutely sure there's going to be a very great deal to discuss in the coming period. So I don't think this will be the last discussion that takes place, but it ends today. So thank you very, very much to everyone who participated and everybody who listened. Thank you. Right. Goodbye. If the team can close us down.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. 谢谢刘星，谢谢刘星老师。
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, John. It was an excellent job.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah,
Take care
excellent.
of yourselves, everybody.
Yeah.
Be safe.
Take care of yourself. Take care of yourself.
Bye, Martin.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank
Okay.
you, John.
До свидания.
Bye-bye.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
See you later.
Bye.